why Ignatius could say these words in AD 107. It was your assertion that the doctrine of the Trinity was established at the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. Could you please respond to these statements made by Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, in AD 107, which is 218 years before that? There is one physician of flesh and of spirit, generate and ingenerate, God in man, true life and death, both from Mary and from God, first passible and impassible, Jesus Christ our Lord, by the will of the Father and of Jesus Christ our God, for our God Jesus Christ, and finally await the one who is above every season, the eternal, the invisible, the one who for our sake became visible, the untouched, the impassible, who for our sake suffered, who endured in every way for our sake. Could you please explain, if the doctrine of the Trinity didn't come about till 325, why Ignatius could say these words in AD 107?
Right? Exhorting obedience to Christ and to the Father and to the Spirit, right? But this idea of the Trinity doctrine, it came over time. Look at that, 110 after Christ. And nobody knew about it. It's amazing.
Why Ignatius could say these words in AD 107. Could you please respond to these statements made by Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, in AD 107?
Ignatius is, we think, an early bishop. We don't really know much about him, except that there are some letters that purport to be from him. He's believed to have been martyred sometime between the year 98 and the year 117. So people have for a very long time been very interested in Ignatius because he's only, 1 or 2 generations after the apostles. This is somebody who easily could have met the apostle John, for instance. The problem is that it has long been very controversial which, if any, letters attributed to Ignatius are really by him. A whole bunch of them have come down to us in manuscripts. I would say that the conservative mainstream position, a position that many Protestant and Catholic scholars would go for nowadays. For instance, if you look in the edition called the Apostolic Fathers, edited by Michael Holmes, you'll see this position in the introduction to the letters of Ignatius. The mainstream conservative position is that exactly 7 of these letters are genuine. The problem is, even those 7 letters come in 3 versions. There's a long one, a medium one, and a short one. The mainstream position is that 7 of the letters in the medium length are genuine, or at least mostly so, maybe with some later corruptions. There is some scholarly consensus that the short version of the letters is just kind of an abridgment, a paraphrase that's been shortened down by somebody later on of the middle-length letters. Okay, so if you want to know what the original letters said, the short ones are just leaving too much out because they seem to be an abridgment of the middle-length letters. What about the much longer version? Scholars are pretty much universally agreed, and I agree as well, that the long version of the letters of Ignatius are from the 4th century. That is, somebody in the 4th century who became known to history as one of the, quote, Arians, a person with that type of theology, took the middle-length letters and stuffed them full of a bunch of other stuff to push it in a, quote, Arian direction. Scholars across the board now agree that this is how we got the long version of the letters. It's just the medium-length ones larded up with a bunch of extra stuff, which is clearly from the 4th century. You would hope then that the middle-length letters would be the genuine ones. Well, I wish it was that simple. When I read the middle-length letters, and some scholars agree, but there's not really a consensus about this, when I read the middle-length letters, I see some things that sound like they're from the early 2nd century, which is when these are supposed to be from, but I also read things that sound like later monarchian theology. I see terminology and issues that really arose particularly in the early 200s. So I think that even the middle-length letters have been heavily corrupted. I guess I think that there probably are some genuine parts there, but there's no way to really separate things out. Right, so we're talking about a difference here of perhaps 100 years, difference between something written around the year 100 and something written around the year 200, or maybe somewhat later than that. It's not that hard to discern these later elements. Imagine that you're reading something that's supposed to be a letter from a soldier who served in World War I. Right, 1914 to 1918. In the middle of this letter, he mentions cybercrime. Well, hold on a second, Buster. Cybercrime? That term was invented in the 1990s. That just can't be right. If this is a genuine letter and not a complete forgery, then somebody has added in this part that mentions cybercrime in a letter from 1918. So it's harder when you get farther on in history than we are from 1918 and from the 90s, but still it can be done. And there are some scholars, a minority, who think that these letters were just wholly forged later on. I think there's probably a genuine core there. Okay, so this is the huge headache that's been caused by this frankly evil Christian habit of forging letters to try to support their theological position, which was just rampant in the ancient world. We need to read the footnotes. We need to read the introductions that scholars give us to these books so that we can know when we're dealing with fakes or with genuine but heavily corrupted sources that we have to be very careful with. So let's stick to sources that are plausibly from the 2nd century. What about the 7 letters of Ignatius? Well, in those 7 letters, if they're genuine, and again, I guess I think that at least some of them are genuine, although I also think they've been corrupted at least once, probably in the late 100s or sometime in the 200s. Really, I think we have to be skeptical about those letters. They seem to pointedly call Jesus God and our God. Again, that's a later habit that just wasn't done around the turn of the 2nd century. You do see it, of course, all over the 3rd century and beyond. Here's a more interesting source. This is the letter called First Clement, which scholars date to perhaps around the year 95. And really, First Clement sounds very much like the New Testament in most ways. The Creator there and the one God there is the Father. Jesus is repeatedly called his servant and is described as our high priest. The book of First Clement never says that Jesus is divine, never says that he has a divine nature and a human nature, and it never says that he existed before his conception. None of these Christological claims are either explicitly said or implied or suggested or even presupposed by anything that's in that book. Again, in this book, it's just God, that is the Father himself, who's the Creator. In fact, that was always the emphasis in Christian literature until a certain point in Christian history. On then to another source. This one's called the Didache, and this was only discovered in the 1800s. It had been long lost, and it's probably from the late 1st century or the first half of the 2nd century. The scholar Bart Ehrman says it's maybe between 100 and 120, although was probably based on earlier materials. It's a very interesting early Christian piece which reflects a strong Jewish influence throughout. And the one God in the Didache is addressed as Holy Father, as Almighty Master, and as Our Father. And it's that one God, the Father, who is said to be the Creator. And Jesus is repeatedly called his servant.
My basic case in my book, How Jesus Became God, and that I presented last night, is as follows. I don't think that Jesus himself called himself God during his public ministry. I personally don't think Jesus imagined he was God. He wasn't God. He was God's prophet.